got a bit of a plan coming together regarding sorting out the timing side bush and journal for this BSA A65 engine that I've been working on recently, and I've come to the conclusion that the timing side journal on the crank is of standard size, but there's a couple of thou wear on it. Now what I've done is I've pressed out the timing side bush and its housing from the crankcase. That was this one, and I've also removed the bush from it, and this is obviously the worn one, which is still, still appear to be a fairly sort of close fit on there, but obviously we saw the play, and I know that there's a thou or two sort of run out or out around on this that would have to be dealt with. Now what I'm going to do, I've got a brand new standard bush here which does go on there, but it's a tightish fit. Now bear in mind there's a split there, it's not a full, it's not a full circle, there is a split there, so you can squeeze that up. Even by hand the bush grips the crank. So my reckoning is by the time this is pressed into one of these, either the thick flanged one or the thin flanged one, I think I'm going to go for the thin flange, because that appears to be the type that should be in there, going by some research that I've done for years and engine numbers and so on. I think I should be using a narrow flanged one with a thrust washer, so that's what I'm going to do. So I'll put the new bush into the narrow flanged one, and obviously the bush will close up slightly when it's pressed into that, and likewise this has an interference fit of a thou or two in a crankcase, which needs to be heated up before you got any chance of pressing this in nicely. So I've done a few before, I know this, so when it comes to it I'll be warming the crankcase up before I attempt to get the timing side bush assembly into the crankcase. So it's certainly not going to grow, and there's probably going to be some take up. So then what I'm going to do with the timing side bush and its housing fitted into this crankcase, as I did last time around and it worked out fine, I'll take the crankcase with the bush fitted and the crank up to my friend who does my regrinds and crank polishings, rebores, valve seats, everything. He does a great job, and I'll get him to just verify that it is going to work, and I'm sure it will, because I bet when I fit this and its housing into the crankcase, I doubt whether this will even go over the crank anymore, because although this is a standard size, it does actually say ream to suit. But what we'll do is we'll give this a light polish or skim, whatever it needs, until it'll go in there cold with a running clearance of no more than 1/1000th of an inch, which is what I did last time around, and we had a lovely sounding smooth engine. So I've got no issues or doubts about doing that, and I know there'll be some people screaming about line boring. Well, they're a matched set of crankcases that came from the factory, matched, and I'm pretty sure that if there'd been any problem with anything being out of step, certainly the housings relative to each other, I think there would have been very, very excessive wear on a timing side bush and a journal, and there wasn't a hell of a lot. So to be fair, I think that'll be fine. And the last engine that I did in this manner, when I trial fitted the crank and tried to spin it there with no more than 1/1000th of an inch clearance on the timing side, I could spin the crank between finger and thumb, so that told me that there was nothing to worry about regarding alignment. One last little thing that I will be doing, hopefully we can see those tiny little pegs there, and they're locating pegs. And what I'm going to do, let's see, is this one. I'll be pressing my new bush into this housing because we've got a hole in there that goes right through for one of those locating pegs. And what happens is when the bush is pressed in, let's see, I've got an old one here somewhere we might be able to have a look at, have I? Yeah, here's the old one. There's a hole there. Now what happens, that hole lines up with that hole, the peg goes in and is held captive obviously when this is pressed home into the crankcase, and that little pin is just a bit of insurance to stop the bush from trying to turn and the oil holes going out of alignment, which apparently is not unknown on some. And I've got one here that's got a new bush pressed into it, and it's a narrow flanged one, but it's ready to go, but I'm not going to use it because it hasn't got the locating pin. Now rather than mess about with trying to drill two different diameter holes in this one, I've got the hole already drilled in this one at 2 diameters, so I'm going to fit the new bush into that one and then just put a small drill through the smaller hole through the bush and then locate it with the pin. So that's the plan of attack. I hope that that all makes sense. And then obviously I'm going to have to get a shim cup and shims for the drive side end of the crank, which has been running in its correct type roller main bearing rather than the earlier type ball. Apparently the ball bearing main bearings were used with the thick flange timing side bush, and the roller bearing drive side main bearings were used with the thinner flanged bush assembly and the thrust washer. So that's what I'm going to go for, and I think finally we might have a good and correct bottom end assembly. So my next job, I'm going to press the new bush into this housing, get the locating pin in it, and then warm the crankcase up and press the whole timing side bush assembly in there, and then we're going to go for a little trip up to Aeron with the crankshaft and the timing side crankcase, and hopefully get it all sorted.